Hey everybody, and welcome to another lecture in this social psych lecture series. This lecture is going to be all about group behavior. So I'm condensing pretty much what I do in like 3 days into hopefully a lecture that will last under an hour. Fingers crossed. All right, so let's get started. I forgot to do an outline for this one, so my bad. It's summertime. I'm gonna use that excuse. So let's talk about let's talk about groups, shall we? What is a group? Well, here's a group of dudes that I really like. I am a Dodgers fan. This is my favorite sports team of all the sports balls. This is a clip of them from 2017, I believe. After a walk-off. Yeah, they're 2018. No, yeah, 2018. Yeah, a winning team, and then they were, beaten by cheaters. The World Series. So really, they won in 2018, we'll say. At least I think so. So what is a group? Well, it could also be this group of people in an elevator. All of those people stuck in an elevator. If you've ever been stuck in an elevator, part of a group too. Okay? Humans and all large primates live in groups. So group life must offer some advantage, like communal hunting and foraging, defending, co-parenting, protection against predators, and so on 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 and so on. And so we have a broad definition of what a group is. Okay, so a collection of individuals, we'll say. Collection of individuals who have relations to one another that make them interdependent to some significant degree. Okay? So a baseball team is a group. The people would generally not regard this elevator as a group, even though you're stuck inside of it. If it breaks down and together, what's going to happen? So when you're in an elevator and it's working, not a group, but when it breaks down and you're stuck in there, it is a group. That's because of the interdependence. So standing next to each other, like either the baseball players or the people in the elevator, doesn't necessarily imply a common goal. But when you create a team and winning or getting out of an elevator alive, that's when you end up with a group. We can bring in a little bit more of some vocabulary here. Entitativity. It's entitativity. The degree to which a collection of people feel like a group. So this is the psychology of groupness. Okay. So what are the features of a cohesive group? Well, those features are the degree to which members interact and depend on one another. So the common bond. And the common bond is characterized by communal sharing and market pricing. It's communal sharing, so giving goods and services back and forth, and then market pricing for goods and services. That's a cohesive group. And then the second feature is the degree to which groups share similar characteristics. Okay, so this would be the common identity. So we have bond and identity. Bond and identity. So, and you've probably heard of the identity part rather than the bond part, which is fine. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about that common identity. Join and identify groups. Okay, so why do people do that? Well, the first reason is to promote and achieve goals. Same thing with teams, like you saw with your favorite sports team or whatever kind of team you're familiar with. Okay, so as we evolved, as humans evolved, group membership enhanced our survival, and so therefore we said to ourselves that this is the best way for our survival. Goal completion, to survive and procreate. That's essentially all our genes want to do. None of this stuff that we've added, that humans have added to life. Our genes just want to procreate, and they saw giving essentially an inanimate object some animacy here, but they saw that this completed the goal, and so we did it. Can't do it solo, or at least they can't procreate solo. The second reason is reducing uncertainty. So this is characterized by Hogg's uncertainty identity theory. So group membership reduces negative feelings of uncertainty about self and others. We know who we belong with. We know who everyone else belongs with, either with us or with some other group. And the groups then reinforce that cultural worldview that I've talked about in previous videos, and those groups then prescribe norms and roles about how people should think and act. So let me give you an example of this one. So this is from Hogg's 2007 paper, Hogg et al. So there were two groups. Okay. People were prompted to feel certain about themselves. And in the other group, people were prompted to feel uncertain. And then they were put into one of two group situations, a low cohesive group and a high cohesive group. And you can see that when people were prompted to feel uncertain about themselves and placed in a high cohesive group, they identified with that group quite heavily, right? They said, oh, that's the group that I want to be with. That's the group that I want to be with, right? As opposed to prompted to feel certain and low group cohesiveness. The group means literally nothing to this group of folks right here, literally mean nothing to them. 4, okay, fine. But on a scale from 1 to 9 or 1 to 10, 4 is pretty friggin' low. And then these differences are at least these differences here are statistically significant. These differences are 2. And then the average of high to low is significant as well. Bolstering self-esteem is the third reason why people join groups. Personal identity is shaped by group membership. This is called social identity theory from Turner and colleagues. Okay, this is what creates that in-group bias that you might be familiar with. Okay, people need to identify with their group, and once they continue to identify with their groups, anyone or anything that's not within their group is going to be placed in the out group, and you favor things that are with your group, and do not favor things that aren't in your group. Okay, and then because your authors really like this idea of mortality salience, and terror management theory, the fourth reason I'll give you for managing mortality concerns is group membership strengthens feelings of connectedness to something bigger and longer lasting than personal existence. Once you're part of a group, you're part of that group forever, at least until somebody says you're out of the group. Why excommunication for Catholics back in the day was so devastating, because what other group than Catholicism is worth joining? Okay. People need to cope with the threatening knowledge of their mortality. So they do this by clinging to those resources. faith in that cultural worldview, which then bolsters their self-esteem. How do groups affect individual performance? Well, this is a much condensed stuff. So if you want to know more about social facilitation, then I do urge you to read more about it. So the first thing that I'll talk about is Triplett's 1898 research. So this has been traced back to at least in the thread of social psychology as social psychology's first experiment, and this is where social facilitation and that effect was coined. Okay, so what Triplett did was he was watching the Tour de France, I believe, and he noticed that cyclists tended to have faster times when riding in the presence of somebody else, another cyclist, than when he noticed them riding by themselves. He then demonstrated this effect in his lab. He concluded that children perform a simple lab task faster than than when performing it by themselves. Okay, so further research demonstrated a couple of things. One, that others could just be observing; they didn't have to be engaged in the same activity. And two, the same pattern can be seen in non-human animals. Animals such as dogs, frogs, and armadillos eat more in the presence of others than they do alone. Ants dig more, fruit flies preen more, and centipedes run through mazes faster. Lots of evidence. However, some philosophical arguments began to crop up, and contradictions began to emerge. So what's the idea here? So in one study, Harvard undergrads were asked to refute a philosophical argument in 5 minutes, but they did better when preparing alone than in a group. Okay, so maybe that mental load was not so helpful being in the presence of others. Even in animal studies, like this, like a complex rat maze, this is not a complex rat maze, this is just a stock photo from the internet. Lab animals in complex mazes performed more slowly than when others are present. So what's the deal? Why is there a difference? And so this is where Bob Zients, yep, that's how you say the name up there. It's not Zajonk, it's Zients. And his first name's Bob, which is great. So this is Zients' model of social facilitation. He came quite a ways after Triplett, of course. So this is his model. Okay, so the end two ideas are social facilitation, that is better in groups, and social inhibition, not better in groups, or perhaps worse in groups. Okay, so to look at the flowchart, we can see that the presence of others leads to some state of arousal. Okay, that state of arousal then leads to the dominant response, what you have learned. And is the dominant response the correct response for the particular task that you're doing? Or is it the incorrect response to the particular task that you're doing? If it's the correct task, that is, I've learned how to shoot a basketball very well, and so once I have the ball in my hands and I'm at a place, court, that I know works, then once I let the ball go, that's facilitation, baby, right? That's why professional athletes love to play in front of crowds, because that whole dynamic makes the dominant response, which is correct. They have lots of practice playing their particular sport, basketball, whatever. They are better in front of a crowd. Now, for me, yeah, sure, I've dabbled with some basketball, but I'm not a very good basketball player. I don't have a lot of jump, and I'm quite inaccurate from longer distances. And so I have the incorrect dominant response to be in front of a big old crowd playing basketball. I'd probably feel like I'm making a fool of myself. True fact. And so thus, I would have the incorrect dominant response, which would lead to social inhibition, which would make me stink like a skunk, I would imagine. Okay, and so Zients then said to encapsulate this all, social facilitation theory, the presence of others increases a person's dominant response in a performance situation, the response that is most likely for that person for that particular task. And he did an experimental test of this with cockroaches. You may be familiar with this cockroach test. So here is a simple maze by the cockroach's lonesome, and then with audience boxes on either side that could see in, and this cockroach could see as they went through. Just a start and an end. There was a light at the end of where the goal was, so the cockroach could go, right? And they were faster. These cockroaches, well, it's the same one. This cockroach's time was faster going through the audience box maze than when the cockroach was then by itself. Okay. Now here's a complex maze. Okay, so the cockroach starts on one side and has to make a turn to get to the goal, right? Audience boxes on either side. So there are two non-goal exits. Hard. This is hard for a cockroach. Cockroaches don't normally do this kind of stuff. And what he found was that when the cockroach ran slower through this hard maze, which was, in general, they actually ran slower through this one than when they were by themselves. So faster over here than here, slower over here versus here. Okay? And that's because the complex maze led to a dominant response of going forward, which is the incorrect one. They had to make a right. They had to make a right turn. And so the audience made the cockroach go slower, which is interesting, right? You wouldn't think of that with cockroaches. But yeah, repeatable, robust, as long as you have good cockroaches, pretty good, right? So applications for this theory are prepping for a speech or a recital. Do that by yourself. Okay, workspace design. Is your task easy and repetitive? Well, then fine. Have that collab space. Work together. It's cool. Don't worry about it. Open concept, whatever. If it's a novel or difficult task, give them privacy. Or if you work at a place, make sure you have an office if it's a novel or difficult task. Right? You don't see too many lawyers working in an open concept office space. Just saying. Okay, so when our performance is not individually evaluated, so we're in a group and we're evaluated as a group, what about the presence of others hampers or hinders our performances? Okay, so I'm going to go over two things in relation to this. Okay, so the first one, well, for one thing, it depends. So what happens? Does it hamper or hinder? Well, it depends on what it is. So the first one that I want to talk about is social loafing. You may be familiar with this one, with group projects that you may have done in your life, because that's really where social loafing comes into play. So people are less likely to perform optimally when they are part of a group. Okay. Another way to put this is that it's a reduction in individual output because of the group. Okay. And that's because things like less accountability is felt for the efforts that anyone does for the group final product, and others hold back beliefs that others will do the same. Okay, so it's like, okay, so maybe I'll do something good, and maybe they'll do something good, and maybe they'll do something good, and then you've got maybe one or two loafers who are like, eh. So they won't put the full effort, and then the loafing can spread. The loafing can spread. So you got those two people in this 5-person group, let's say, who are like, and maybe one other person's like, well, if they're not putting the full effort in, maybe I won't either. And so then loafing then becomes a little contagious. Okay. A third reason why people might socially loaf is because feelings of dispensability. This is a rarer reason, and one of the reasons why I say that is because if you think about how your group projects go, of course you're not dispensable to the final group product, but there can be in like big corporations or big giant groups, there is the sense that my position isn't as any more valuable than anybody else in this group, and so why put forth an effort when I could just be replaced? So that's not the case in certain group dynamics, but it is the case in broader sense group dynamics. Okay. And then the fourth reason is that more value is assigned to potential individual versus group accomplishments. And so if this is the case, that is the individual accomplishments are weighted more heavily in that person's mind, then of course they're only going to do things that benefit them and not the group. And so the accomplishment of the group becomes less important versus the individual's values and goals, etc. The last reason is that if the task is uninteresting, there's very little personal meaning, or it comes without an attractive reward, well, then you're going to have social loafing. These are all characteristics of the task or the outcome of the task that might lead to social loafing. So task is uninteresting, lacks personal meaning, comes without an attractive reward. So if you're on crew, just kidding. No, crew is an incredibly important team sport. And if there is any one social loafer on crew in this boat that requires everyone to use their oar appropriately and in sync, you can't have any social loafers. You cannot have any social loafers on a crew team. Okay. Oh, looks like my animations are all wrong on this one, so I'm just going to throw everything up on the slides here. You can go back and look at these slides and just PowerPoint with the slide itself. Apologies. So I have two experiments to share with you about social loafing. One is Ingham and colleagues in 1974 did a really cool rope pulling experiment. They only had one side. The other side was attached to one of those, force gauge machines, so they could measure how much pull there was. So the main independent variable, not this graph here, this is for Latine. So the main independent variable was the manipulation of whether the subject was alone or in a group. When they were in a group, so you can see three sets of hands here. When they were in a group, only one of them was the participant, and the other 2, 3, 4, however many there were Confederates who only pretended to pull the rope. Okay. And what they found was when the participants were in a group, they pulled with less force than when they were alone. Okay, so when they were alone, they pulled as hard as they could. When they were with a group that didn't appear like it was pulling, well, the social loafing spread. Ooh, right? So that's an interesting finding, right? When you're with a group and you have to do that, nobody loafs. Otherwise, you've got a big problem on your hands, right? Bib Latine, who we'll talk about at the end of this term with helping. He and colleagues in 1979 did another interesting study where they had people loaf around. This time, they isolated participants to sound by putting them in earphones and blindfolding them. So over the earphones, like, you know, the kinds of earphones that you've seen me wear in other videos, or that people wear at, you know, the airport or something like that. And they also blindfolded them. Some participants were told they were by themselves, and others thought they were in groups. So before they got blindfolded, before they got the earmuffs, they were given this information. You can see here, alone and 2, 4, and 6 size. Okay. They were asked to clap or shout in different experiments and make as much noise as possible. Okay. So there was the cheering orange line, so that was one experiment they were in, and then there was the clapping one. So they did either or. I'm just want to be clear, they did either or. So two different experiments, 2 different times. They did either shouting, cheering / and then clapping. Okay, to make as much noise as possible, right? So the bigger the group size, you can see the less sound that was created, the less noise they made. So when they were, so this is sound pressure per person. So they had microphones in there recording how much sound the people created. And I would imagine this is some sort of scale that's collapsed from like decibels or something like that. And so you can see here that they both just fall depending on the amount of sound. It's actually really interesting, right? So how do we reduce social loafing? Well, external coercion. Tell somebody who gives a damn. Okay. Tell an authority figure. Have the authority figure come and say, listen, if you don't pull your weight, you done. Okay? Make each group member feel important or unique. Okay? Give everyone an important and group useful task. Group coercion. So this is a similar thing to the first one, but this is where everyone in the group just confronts that single person. It's like, yo, you're out of the group. If you can't participate, get or join us or get out, that sort of thing, right? And then the last one is the individual reward for group work is kind of important. And so you may be familiar with this, doing group work yourself, where you get a personal grade rather than a group, or in lieu of a group grade, or you get both, a group grade plus an individual component. And sometimes that individual component is something that you have to deliver, a deliverable on your own, or you do some sort of peer evaluation, and peer evaluation sort of, if there's consensus about a loafer, then that loafer gets penalized. So there are a number of ways that you can create an individual reward for group work. Okay. It's important to know that with all of these, it's important to know that this is a social loafing is an unconscious process. Even when we think we're trying our hardest, we may not be. It's just a fact. There are some people who hop on the social loafing train without a ticket. They are free riders. No, but I mean, really, what happens when people take conscious advantage of the hard work of others? Well, you get a degradation of performance and product, and it's it looks poorly on everything. It ends up being a bad look for everyone. All right, group decision making. Group decision making. This is when we say to ourselves, is multiple heads better than one? Well, our assumption is that they are. We make this assumption constantly. And that when we do make those decisions, that they are better than the individual could ever make. Okay. This is true when there is a precise factual answer. A group is more likely to arrive at the right answer. Case in point, trivia nights. Trivia nights. So when we have even division of labor, and when the task is to remember lots of info, well, you have all of these memories. So trivia night. It's just when you have lots of things to know and lots of things to recall. Trivia night. That's pretty much only when group decision making is worth it. Okay. However, it's not true when individual goals outweigh group goals. So people then start working for themselves and their own goals rather than the group goals, which they might be in alignment. They might be the same, but still people act in their own interests rather than the group interest. And that's when multiple heads aren't better than one. Okay. So what situations might these be? Well, evaluation concerns, when the group might hurt someone's feelings and you don't want to be a part of that. And then on the other side of the coin, avoiding responsibility if something goes wrong, which, happens a lot, right? You're like, I don't want to be a part of that group decision. I'm going to back up here. Woo! Okay. And so we're going to focus on one of those situations, and it's called groupthink. And then we're going to focus on, just very quickly, another one of those situations called group polarization. Groupthink. Okay. This is a kind of faulty thinking by highly cohesive groups in which the critical scrutiny that should be devoted to issues is subverted by social pressure to reach a consensus. So what are the antecedents of groupthink? What are the things that come before? Well, high cohesiveness, like I said, the insulation of the group, directive leadership, and high stress and few options. So here's a classic example for you. JFK and the Bay of Pigs incident in Cuba. The Kennedy administration in 1962 attempted to overthrow Fidel Castro's communist regime. So they deposited a group of CIA-trained Cuban refugees on the beaches of Bay of Pigs, which is a bay on the island of Cuba. But they failed to provide air cover. Those refugees were promptly captured. The U.S. was humiliated. And the rest is history. Another good example of this could be the Bush administration and its pushing of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq that led to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. So the idea here is that what happens is we have to reach consensus. And so what ends up happening is that shallow processing, so very facile processing, kind of like what we talked about in the previous persuasion video where I said that this is peripheral route processing. So this is very shallow peripheral route processing. Narrow consideration of alternatives, feelings of invulnerability or the illusion of invulnerability, and moral superiority, especially when you have this antecedent of direct leadership. Lots of things can go wrong. there could be a lot of opinions, but those opinions don't get discussed. Those alternatives don't get discussed. They don't come into play because the idea is we self-censor based on what the strong leader wants. We find solutions and people withhold opinions. Okay. And so the consequences are fairly tragic and a lot of groupthink, right? So you get incomplete survey of objectives and alternatives, poor information search, failure to account for risks, which is the huge one there, failure to work out contingency plans because you get this invulnerability and you're like, plan A is going to be fine. We don't need a plan B, C, or D. And then failure to reappraise any other alternatives that might have been on the table. Okay. So after Bay of Pigs, one cabinet member was, quote, haunted for having kept so silent during those critical discussions. I can only explain my failure to speak up as reluctance to blow the whistle on this nonsense, end quote. Other members of the cabinet also admitted that as a newly formed group, no one wanted to step on each other's toes. No one wanted to bend over backwards and, have JFK, who was a really strong leader at the time, just sort of walk all over them and probably fire them. That was the fear. So how do you avoid it? How do you to prevent groupthink? Well, the leader of the group takes a step back and doesn't give their opinion. And they don't want to cloud the ideas, the brainstorming. The other way to do that is when the group is coming to a decision and working on stuff, they don't isolate themselves. So this isn't a jury where we have to deliberate in secrecy and behind closed doors. We need to welcome new perspectives that we get as the group. And throw this out here. What does outside the group have to say? You could also designate a devil's advocate and somebody who is just constantly thinking of the opposite effects. Okay. In subsequent meetings, Kennedy would frequently excuse himself from those meetings from the Situation Room. He brought in outside experts and he appointed individuals to find all issues. That is the mark of a good leader. They recognize their mistakes and then they correct them. And then, of course, tragically, we all know what happened to JFK in 1963. Group polarization was the other one. This is the tendency for group decisions to become more extreme than the decisions or attitudes that are made up by the individuals. Okay, so let's say I have an opinion on issue A. Well, my opinion on issue A then coalesces with everyone else's opinions in my group on opinion A, and we end up more extreme in our position on A than we would in any other case. Okay, so whatever way any individual are leaning, the group discussion tends to make that person lean farther in that direction. Okay, so it's called a risky shift. A risky shift. Okay, so when you get a risky shift and you put that risky shift into a group setting, that's when you get group polarization. So, and then a couple of things form group polarization: persuasive arguments. As individuals, we're more likely to come up with arguments for our own position than against it. I think that's pretty clear. Put us in a group that tends to lean the same way. We're exposed to even more arguments for the position we already endorsed, making our opinion stronger. Social comparison. We judge ourselves in comparison to others, of course. Cultural differences also play a role. Polarization in modern life is Facebook. Facebook, and Twitter, I guess. Facebook and Twitter. Yay! oh, this one makes you pause, right? So, whatever opinion you have on something, the group that you identify with makes that polarized in a completely. We have like extreme left versus extreme right in the United States, and it's tiring, very tiring. All right, so how do we make group work? Okay, toothpaste for dinner, good stuff. That's how you do it. Brainstorm. We don't like brainstorming. Let's modify the brainstorming, of course. So identify the problem as a group, okay, which will prevent social loafing, and engage with private brainstorming. Okay, some anonymous private brainstorming. People throw ideas in a hat. Okay, present all solutions without evaluation. Okay, discuss, rank them, act on them. We can increase group diversity, ensuring the presence of dissenting voices, reinterpreting group cohesiveness, and encouraging individuality. These are all good marks for making group work. Okay, encouraging individuality, but also saying, all right, the group is good, but what about we phrase it like this, or we identify the group like this? Okay. That's how you improve group decision making. That's what makes it nice. Okay. We're going to end this lecture with a little bit of getting lost in the crowd. Deindividuation. Okay, deindividuation. This is when you have a reduced sense of individual identity accompanied by diminished self-regulation that comes over people when they're in a large group. Okay, so again, we can apply this kind of antecedent psychological and behavioral effects. So the antecedent, I think, that is most associated with de-individuation is anonymity. If you are anonymous and you don't have to identify yourself, either by wearing a mask, putting on a face mask, hiding, getting lost in a giant crowd of people, that makes you anonymous. Okay. Stimulus overload. A lot of de-individuation occurs in high emotional situations. So a good example of this are the protests for George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others in recent memory in the months of May and June. There's a lot going on, and the police weren't helping a lot in those situations, and so there's a lot of stimuli. And then, of course, the diffusion of responsibility. Those protests were also marked by some looting and other vandalization, right? And some people took advantage of that situation to do those acts. And so no one person could potentially be in trouble for that. Although, there is a song regarding the Rodney King riots by Sublime, April 29th, 1992, which is the day of the Rodney King riots in Los Angeles. And the lyrics of the first and second verse of the song are Bradley Noel talking about how he got a bunch of stuff by going to various stores and participating in the looting. And he wasn't arrested or whatever. Fast forward to these protests and looting that was done in the Apple store. Apple came out and said, for anybody who stole Apple devices, well, we're tracking you. So is there a diffusion of responsibility? Well, maybe in the moment, but now, if Apple is being honest, then they know who exactly to or where exactly to find those devices. Okay. The internal states, the psychological states that we feel when we're de-individualized is a lessened self-observation and evaluation. So self-regulation and self-control diminish, and then weakening of internal controls, okay, which increases impulsive and deviant acts. The more people are in a mob, the more brutal the mob's attack will be, okay? Warriors who use face paint and other identity hiding techniques are more vicious, historically, okay? We see a lot of destructiveness on Halloween. Just this past Halloween, we were planning on walking around with our kids, and we left a candy bowl on our doorstep with a sign that says, "Please take one." And a group of teenagers came by, grabbed the entire bowl, and ran off before we could figure out who they were or what direction they went, or even going after them in any way. Okay, so and then that's part of Halloween, right? And so the behavioral effects are pretty marked. Okay. Other things that I have here on the slide include irrationality, antisocial activity. Okay. It's interesting that we can apply de-individuation principles to something as common / ubiquitous as war. That's truly remarkable. So is it just bad behavior, or is it something else? So let's talk about Johnson and Downing in 1979. They had a group of two groups of women, two groups of women participate in a shocking of an obnoxious person. That obnoxious person was a Confederate, an actor. He was acting obnoxiously. Okay. The independent variable was that there were two independent variables. One was group identity. They were a hate group or they were nurses. Okay. And anonymity, name tags or not. Okay. So whether or not the person was wearing a name tag or they were not wearing a name tag, and whether they were in hate group robes, you can imagine what kind of robes we're talking about. And then the other group wore nurse uniforms. Okay. And you can see here that when they were anonymous and wore hate group uniforms, they shocked the hell out of people. Versus when they were in nurses' uniforms and they didn't. This is anonymous, so no name tags, nurse's uniform. I don't want to shock a nurse that I don't know. I don't want to do that. But if I'm anonymous and there's hate group stuff, well, where's the buzzer? I want to press it. Shock them. So is it just bad behavior? No, it's not. Because the women, when they were wearing nurses' uniforms, felt like nurses, even though they were lost in the crowd. When they had to wear hate group robes, that's the power of the situation taking over because they played into that hate. So it's not just bad behavior. So let's talk about a model of de-individuation. De-individuation reflects characteristics of the group norm. Okay, so whatever the group norm will allow. So this is from Postmates and Spears from 1998. Okay, it's 22 years old. So as a personal identity and internal controls are submerged, according to what we identified as de-individuation, social identity takes over. So that social identity is what leads people to act in the way that they do according to this model. So consequences of lose yourself in the music the moment you want it. Don't ever let it go, because you only get one shot. Do not miss your chance to blow, because opportunity comes just once in a lifetime. Lose yourself. Consequences of losing yourself to a group identity depend on what group you lose it to. Okay, what group you lose it to. So do you lose it to a hate group and a violent group, or do you lose it to a peaceful group? These are questions, right? That will depend. That will change what occurs in the de-individuation process, what behaviors ultimately come out of it. Okay. And the last thing, why do people leave and disidentify with groups? Because they don't want to be in that group anymore. Okay? They don't want to be in that group anymore. It no longer serves the psychological needs that they need. Okay? So the group no longer promotes survival. The group no longer reduces uncertainty. It actually produces uncertainty. Okay? Bolstering self-esteem. It no longer bolsters self-esteem. It actually reduces self-esteem. And managing mortality concerns is no longer paramount in this group. And so you're like, well, if they're not going to help my immortality, then why am I here? Let me find another group that will help my feelings of immortality. That is my legacy. And I think a good film that reflects why people leave and disidentify with groups is American History X. If you've never seen that film, it can be quite jarring, especially in our current social climate. But the main character, played by Edward Norton, is a neo-Nazi, goes to prison for for a brutal crime to two black men. He goes to prison. He comes out, and he leaves the skinhead group that he was once in, this neo-Nazi group, and it is literally all four of these. For all four of these reasons. The neo-Nazi group doesn't promote survival. In fact, it's the exact opposite. The neo-Nazi group produces uncertainty because nobody likes neo-Nazis. It no longer bolsters his self-esteem after he's had conversations with a social worker at the prison. He found other things that bolstered his self-esteem rather than this group. And then managing mortality concerns, he realizes that for him, and especially his little brother, this group will probably lead to early deaths rather than long, stable lives and nice and helpful and encouraging legacies. So I definitely recommend American History X if you want to see why people leave and disidentify with groups fairly clearly. I mean, there's a lot of other social psych in that movie, of course. It has to do with prejudice, stereotyping, discrimination, all that sort of stuff. It's a really good film, and great filmmaking with the black and white and color motifs. And that is going to be it for this video. Please leave your comments, suggestions, and feedback down below. Come up with those questions. For this particular stuff, I basically condensed maybe 2 chapters, maybe 1, I don't remember, into this 50-minute video or whatever. So yeah, we'll expand on more of this stuff in the live stream. And so until the next video, bye.